morning, everyone, and welcome to our session on democracy and the role of European citizens. I am Bilun. I'm the editor-in-chief of POLICYPRESS, a civic journalism platform dedicated to connecting citizens to policymaking through democratic dialogue in Cyprus and Europe. And I have the pleasure of moderating today. We are joined today with three excellent speakers whose work captures this theme from different yet deeply connected angles. Ms. Andrea Kosta, PhD candidate in International Relations and European Studies here at the University of Nicosia with a master's degree in comparative politics from Pantheon University. Her research interests focus on far-right politics, political party families, political participation and inclusion. She has published her work on political representation, gender, and social policy. She has professional experience as project manager and scientific researcher in EU-funded initiatives as well, bridging research with practice. Mr. Yiannos Katsourides, associate professor in comparative politics at the Department of Politics and Governance here at University of Nicosia. He has published 3 books all on the elements that concern today's panel. He looks at Southern European politics, radical left and far-right political parties, democratic backsliding, political participation, culture, institutions, and nationalism. Also with Mr. Alexandros Christos Gkotinakos, research fellow at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, works on comparative political behavior and public opinion with the ActEU project. He works on comparative political behavior, public opinion, and survey methodology. He will present data on how trust and participation evolve across European societies. Together, their work invites us to confront a central question. When citizens lose trust, when rights become conditional, and when democratic norms are tested from within, what role can European citizens play in renewing democracy? With that, let's begin our session. I will invite each one of our speakers to take the floor before we move into a moderated discussion and later a Q&A. So the first presentation will be with Ms. Andrea Kosta.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation today is entitled, Who is Democracy for? Far-Right Politics and the Redefinition of Human Rights. My presentation examines how the contemporary rise and how the institutionalization of far-right politics in Europe affects the foundation of democracy, specifically through targeting the human rights. My analytical lens is the rhetoric of the far right and how they redraw who is entitled and who is not entitled of the protections of that human rights guarantee. This matters because human rights are not an accessory to democracy. They are the conditions that make equal democratic participation possible. They ensure that every person can participate politically without fear, exclusion, or discrimination. When rights becomes conditional, when only some of the citizens are considered real citizens, democracy becomes weaker, more exclusionary, and more vulnerable to authoritarian logic. So the central argument I put forward here is that the legitimization of far-right ideas leads to rights withdrawal, and rights withdrawal reshapes democracy from pluralist to exclusionary. Kasmude argues that we are now in the fourth wave of far-right politics, where far-right narratives and discourses are being legitimized. Having this in mind, we are currently living through a paradox. Across Europe, public support for democracy remains strong, but in abstract terms. Yet support to actors who challenge democratic norms is expanding. Far-right parties are no longer at the margins of our political systems. They enter parliaments and they influence political agendas, and in many cases, they also are part of governments. Even when not in power, they reshape the boundaries of what is politically acceptable. Policies that were once perceived as mainstream, once perceived as discriminatory or illiberal, they are now appeared as mainstream. This is why this moment becomes a turning point. The threat to democracy is not the absence of democratic institutions, but the presence of actors who selectively hollow them out from within. How does this normalization happen now? The literature identifies several well-established mechanisms. Electoral success provides democratic legitimacy. People voted for us. Copycat actions by mainstream parties validate far-right discourse. Institutional access, committees, ministries, and of course public funds turn far-right rhetoric into law. The nation-first identity framing redraws politics as a competition between the insiders and the outsiders. What is essential to understand here is that the line between mainstream right and democratic right and far-right actors becomes increasingly blurred. This ambiguity allows illiberal ideas to circulate under the cover of democracy. A key feature of this fourth wave is that the far right moves its struggle to the human rights arena. Human rights are reframed in three main ways: as privileges given to undeserving outsiders, especially migrants or minorities, as threats to the national security and national dominance and cultural identity, as impositions by elites, whether international courts or NGOs. Symbolically, this turns rights from something universal to something conditional, from something that protects to something that supposedly harms the nation. So instead of asking, what rights shall we expand? The question becomes, whose rights we can remove without any consequences. To illustrate these mechanisms at work, we can examine three recent examples within the EU. In Hungary, in 2025, legislation banning LGBTQ+ public events and enabling enhanced policing significantly restricted freedoms of expression and peacefully gatherings. In Italy, anti-migration policies repeatedly conflict with international human rights obligations, especially the rights of asylum seekers and protections against inhumane treatments. In Poland, a 2025 bill, suspension of asylum rights, undermining non-refoulement and access to protection. In all these cases, rights are restricted through parliamentary procedures. This is the crucial point here, that illiberal outcomes are being produced through democratic institutions. The effects of these shifts can be grouped into broader impacts. First, delegitimizing minority protections. Migrants, Roma, Muslims, LGBTQ+ people are treated as threats to the nation and not as equal citizens deserving rights. Secondly, gender, education, and family rights. Sexual education, reproductive rights, and LGBTQ+ equality are attacked as dangerous or anti-family, reducing rights related to bodily autonomy and identity. Thirdly, weakening the rule of law. Courts and oversight institutions are framed as obstacles to the will of the people, making it easier to selectively withdraw protections. So protection becomes conditional and equality becomes negotiable. What does this trajectory mean? The fourth wave marks a shift away from rights-based democracy toward identity-based democracy, we could say, where belonging depends on conformity to dominant cultural norms. As elected far-right actors normalize illiberal ideas and far-right discourse, democratic norms erode from within. Citizens become more accepting of inequality, especially when framed as protection of national values. Human rights might be losing their universal meaning. They appear optional or only for those defined as belonging. So democracy does not exactly collapse, it simply becomes something smaller or something more exclusionary. To conclude, if we want to safeguard democracy in Europe, we must defend human rights, not as a luxury, but as the core of democratic citizenship. This means protecting universal and indivisible rights, challenging exclusionary narratives in public life, investing in civic education and participation, strengthening EU mechanisms against internal backsliding. Ultimately, the question I began with remains central. Who is democracy for? Our answer to that question will determine the future of democratic life in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, Andrea Kosta. The next presentation will be by Yiannos Katsourides.
So good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation, for being here. I woke up very early this morning and I realized my two co-panelists had slides, had presentations, and I didn't. And thankfully I woke up at 5. But to remedy this, my slides are just pictures. So it's just for you to have something up there and not watch me. So my contribution today is about democratic backsliding in the European Union and the future of democracy. So it's a bit of more generic debate and not a presentation of some research. So I'm mostly overviewing the trends. And I have to state my position from the beginning that I am, one, pessimistic about the future of liberal democracy. And second, I'm critical of the functioning of democracy, both at the state level and at the European Union level. Start this discussion about democracy. It made me revisit again the very famous thesis by Huntington about the 3 waves of democratization. Famously, he argued that the modern history of representative government unfolds in broad democratic waves, each followed by a period of reversal. And I think that's the most crucial of his points. We know that he categorized democratization process in 3 waves. The first one starting in the early 19th century and lasting until 1920s and 1930s, over a century, when the fascist and the militarist regimes dismantled electoral institutions. Then we had a second wave starting around 1943, driven by the defeat of the Axis powers, the creation of the new constitutions in the occupied states, and the decolonization process. And the reversal came in the 50s and the 60s, when many new states slipped into single-party or military rule. The third wave, which is much more contemporary, opened in 1974 with democratization in the southern part of Europe, and it extended towards the end of the 80s in Eastern Central Europe, parts of Africa, and Asia. However, since the early 2000s, scholars and observers have debated whether the world is now experiencing a third reversal, sometimes described as democratic backsliding or democratic recession. I will come back to this, but I would like first to contextualize a bit the debate in terms of comparative politics, since this is what we are doing. We know that political scientists usually use categories, or often or all the time we use categories. And in terms of democratic regimes, we usually use 2 types of categorizations: full democracies and flawed democracies. At the top, we have a very small number of full democracies, roughly representing 6% of the total world's population, countries like Canada, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and some states in the northern and Western Europe. These systems are considered to be full democracies, not only because they hold competitive elections, but because substantially they protect civil liberties. They deliver transparent and efficient public administration. However, we have signs, even in these countries, that the democratic idea exceeds democratic practice, which creates gaps in the quality of political representation, the transparency of decision-making, and the equality of citizens. And we know for a fact that when living standards stagnate or public services falter, the contrast between promise and performance sparks protest, it drives anti-establishment voting, and pushes the governments to demonstrate that they remain responsive and accountable. The flawed democracy is a much larger group, twice the size, around 50 countries come under this label, but approximately they cover 38 of the world's population. They meet the procedural minimums, and that's, I think, the most important thing to highlight, that usually we meet these procedural minimums, such as holding regular elections, some protection of individual and civil rights, but they struggle with media pressures, with weak parliaments, underdeveloped political cultures, and low levels of political participation. And here we have an array of countries ranging from Cyprus, Greece, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, France, Italy in Europe, and countries like Brazil, Argentina, India, and the Philippines, illustrating the diversity of experiences inside this category. Citizens can change the leaders at the elections, at the ballot box. However, they often sense that the real power lies elsewhere, or that everyday governance is unclear and unreliable. And here is where the overall debate about democratic backsliding becomes both timely and crucial. What are the patterns and the indicators? We use a number of them. I think the Economist Intelligence Unit is one of the most reliable one, and they identify two converging trends. First, that the growth in the number of democracies has stalled, if it's not decreasing. And second, that in many existing democracies and the EU as a whole, score for civil liberties and political culture have slipped. The symptoms here include greater reliance on technocrats and expert bodies at the expense of popular input, the rise of unelected agencies with broad authority, and major policy choices negotiated usually behind closed doors, sometimes in supranational venues. The political parties appear detached from their electorates, while harassment of journalists and restrictions on freedom of expression become more frequent. The result is a much thinner version of democracy that preserves elections but weakens accountability and voice. And this is what we describe as democratic backsliding. And the crucial point here is that it does not take place through coups or through violent overthrows. It involves the weakening of institutions that ensure transparency, accountability, and the protection of rights, typically through legal or procedural changes introduced by the elected leaders, rather than the violent overthrows and coups. There are a lot of cases here that we can think, but the sharpest decline has occurred in a small number of states within the European Union, where the governing parties have remained in office for long periods of time and used their dominance to reshape institutions. Hungary, for example, under Fidesz, Poland under the Law and Justice parties, which have weakened constitutional courts, politicized judicial councils, and concentrated media ownership, while at the same time they kept regular elections intact. Turkey, a member of the Council of Europe, moved even farther after the 2016 coup attempt, enhancing the executive branch against parliamentary authority and oversight, jailing thousands of judges, journalists, and opposition figures. And in the Western Balkans, we have the cases such as Serbia's political system, which is heavily relied on patronage networks and media capture, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the ruling elites often stole anti-corruption reforms and criminalized some forms of dissent. However, we have seen these signs in established democracies as well. We have a lot of warning signs. Greece, spyware scandal and press freedom concerns. United Kingdom, very contentious limits on protest and rhetoric against activists. Macron's style of governing through practices of decrees. What are the common drivers behind this? One is executive efforts to reduce judicial or parliamentary checks in the name of efficiency and security. Soft capture of public and private media through ownership changes, advertising pressure, or regulatory fines. Thirdly, majoritarian rhetoric that frames civil society criticism as foreign interference or an attack on national sovereignty, and polarized informational environments that erode trust in impartial oversight and facilitate rapid legal change. Having said this, where does it leave us with regard to the debate over democracy's future? If we travel back 25 years, Francis Fukuyama portrayed the collapse of communism as the end of history, meaning the ideological triumph of liberal democracy. Roughly 2 decades later, Robert Kagan and other political scientists wrote a book about the return of history, essentially answering to Fukuyama, arguing that the international rivalries and regime competition had re-emerged, if it had ever stopped. The years since have confirmed that view. Democratic governments confront social fragmentation, unequal economic outcomes, voter alienation, fierce dispute over the balance between individual rights and majority rule, just to name a few. Yet, the most corrosive problem is the decline of trust. A number of surveys reveal that many citizens still value the idea of democracy, but they have grown skeptical about the way this is practiced, believing that office holders and connected interests set the agenda while the ordinary people are sidelined. And where does this leave us? The trendy word, populism, where it steps in, a style of politics that claims to speak for the people against the self-serving elite. Many cases can be thrown here, from Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, Javier Milei, Narendra Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and many more. Each one of them building support by promising to bypass ineffective institutions, punish unresponsive officials, and give voice to those who feel ignored. To be sure, populism can energize participation and expose genuine failures of governance. However, it also risks further eroding checks and balances if the leaders treat independent courts and assemblies and media as obstacles to the popular will, which is the usual case. This is probably the most controversial slide. Is the European Union democratic? Something I have been puzzling myself for years now, and whether the European Union can actually be the remedy to all this discussion, and I think it relates a bit with the debates in the previous panel about the enlargement. My short answer is that I am not sure. If we measure against the criteria we use to detect democratic backsliding, and to name a few: transparency, equal representation, effective popular control into the EU system, I think we would say that the EU still falls short in important ways. A lot of lawmaking, in effect, takes place in opaque dialogues or trilogues between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. The very powerful European Council decides very strategic questions behind closed doors. Independent, but at the same time unelected institutions such as the European Central Bank and a growing array of regulatory agencies make decisions that shape everything from monetary policy to digital markets with limited direct scrutiny by voters, by citizens, by parties or civil society. And turnout, we know that is very low. In a nutshell, we might say that the European Union is partly democratic. It embeds election, rule of law, guarantees, and multiple checks, yet it still delegates major authority to bodies that voters cannot easily sanction. To conclude, I think that democratic backsliding is less of a sudden collapse and more a gradual thinning of norms of participation and accountability. The tension between the democratic ideals and the lived reality of the people runs through both full and flawed democracies alike, feeding resentment and encouraging leaders who pledge to break existing constraints. Whether today's reversal deepens or is ultimately reversed in favor of a renewed wave of reversal will depend on the capacity of democratic societies to rebuild trust, strengthen inclusive institutions, and deliver effective policy without surrendering the core principle that governments derive their legitimacy from, which is the consent of the governed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Katsourides. And next up, we have Alexandros, Christos, Gkotinakos.
No, this is not the one. But this should be the one.
This is the correct one?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I hope it's good enough. So thank you everybody for still being here. It's been an incredible 2 days for me. I've been given a lot of food for thought. So this presentation is called Patterns and Trends in Political Trust and Participation in the European Union. You'll see the ActEU logo, and this is in some sense, you know, an ActEU panel. So I'm affiliated with a project, so I guess it falls on me a little bit to do the honors and introduce the project. So I think what I want to do is discuss a little bit about the motivation behind the project, and perhaps since it's nearing its sunset, I can give you an overview of some selected findings we have throughout the years, and then maybe finish with a couple of points for discussion that sort of I hopefully connect back to the discussions we've been having over today and yesterday. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with a figure as this one, which is like trends in political participation construed as electoral participation, so turnout, and the falling trends across countries. So you can see individual country lines as well as the smooth average across levels of governance. And you can see that, you know, overall there's a drop in turnout from, you know, the 80s especially onwards. And for political scientists, this is considered like a bad thing normatively. And the idea is of, you know, how can we understand these patterns, and how can we perhaps, you know, if indeed we accept that turnout is a good thing and we want high levels of turnout, how can we empower citizens to express their opinions towards the political system in perhaps multiple ways? So I'm going to introduce you the conceptual framework of the ActEU project, which centers on political trust and attempts to connect political trust to political behavior, political attitudes. So you might think of current discussions on political polarization across different issues, and of course, citizens' political representation and the association. So it's like a triangle of different relationships. So then you may ask, why political trust? And I think we've been mentioning this a little bit over the couple of days when we discussed, for example, trust between communities in Cyprus. We discussed trust about international relations, and the motivation can be cross-disciplinary. So for example, if you're an economist, Fukuyama is not an economist, but he has a book on trust, which sort of posits that, you know, it lubricates the economy, it lowers transaction costs. So trust is something desirable for the society. As political scientists, we're mostly interested in institutions. As you know, I don't know if you can believe that, but so we tend to think of political systems as, and I'm referring to democratic political systems, as systems of inputs and outputs, whereby inputs are citizens' preferences and outputs are policy outcomes. And of course, there's procedures that intervene. So when we discuss trust, we tend to think of trust as a key indicator of legitimacy. So political decisions are legitimate if people trust the government and think that the political system is working as is intended to be. And to do that, the ActEU framework has tons of different data and a really original and innovative infrastructures through survey experiments, data harmonization of secondary data, focus groups, and, you know, hopefully it leads to a couple of policy proposals that you may find interesting. So in the next couple of slides, I want to focus a little bit on the diagnosis and sort of question some of the things that we might have for granted regarding trust. So first of all, how might political trust towards institutions, in other words, be related to turnout? And here you can see the unit of analysis is the country year, as in the country election year. And you can see that there's a general trend, a positive association between trust and turnout, as you might expect. So countries, high trust countries, are also high turnout countries, right? But there are important caveats. It's not the best correlation I've seen in my life. And you can imagine, like, we can partition the graph into 4 quadrants. And we're in Cyprus, and I'm Greek, so you can see that both Cyprus and Greece, I'm not sure how easy it is to see, are like low trust countries, but high turnout countries as well. So I think this complicates a little bit the discussion on the political effects of trust, as in, it's important, but it's not the single, fountain of turnout or political participation. And in some sense, they're non-linearity, so it can work in the opposite way as well. And in terms of political participation is not limited to turnout. So citizens have various channels to express their opinions in modern democracies. So we have a couple of them. This is data from the European Social Survey. It's weighted using post-ratification weights to mitigate non-response bias. So you can see how citizens tend to engage across time through different modes with the political system. And it's interesting that petitions tend to be more popular overall. But if that doesn't complicate things, enough already, there's no single trend in the European Union. And I know it's a little bit hard to distinguish in a plot like this, but it's interesting to consider, for example, that different countries prefer to express their political views through different ways. Indicatively, if you want to look, for example, at Spain or France, you can see that demonstrations are sort of the model mode of political participation, which is very different from the Nordic countries who enjoy wearing badges or signing petitions primarily. TEPSA also has an infographic on this, so if I piqued your interest, you can have a look before reading the report. So I don't want to linger too much on that, but I think it's interesting that non-electoral participation, and it's not shown here, so you have to take my word, but it's not related at all to political trust. So there are a few cases where you can say that there's a bit of a correlation, but sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative. So distrust can also motivate political participation, which makes a lot of conceptual sense. But I think when we're discussing political trust, it's helpful to stop and ask, what do we mean by political trust? Trust towards whom, right? And at the core of the ActEU project is the advent of multi-level governance in Europe. So as you know, multi-level governance refers to, yes, the horizontal as well, but mostly like the vertical dispersion of political power and the sharing of responsibilities between different levels of government. So citizens can trust the local government, they can trust the national government, and they can trust the European government in different but related ways. So I'm going to show you my country, Greece, which I think is an interesting illustration. You can see that compared to the, and this is data from the ActEU project, the ActEU survey, you can see how compared to the EU-wide mean, Greece is a low-trust country, but only if you focus on the domestic level. It's the exact opposite if you look at European institutions. In other words, Greeks tend to trust their domestic government less than other Europeans, but the European level much more than the rest of Europe. So there's a bit of a compensation, right, at the system level, which is quite interesting, I feel like. Okay, so you can see that the trend is very different in other countries, but I don't have too much time to go through this. So maybe a couple of discussion points before I move on to this. So we know that there's okay, so political trust is important, and in some sense, and it's certainly normatively important, and we want citizens to trust the government as long as it's trustworthy, of course. And we know that there's no single trend in participation, right? So I think what's important to take away is that when discussing the policy implications of such research, is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to anything, because there's no one-size trend in Europe. We can discuss, for example, the impact of the euro crisis on political trust, which was damaging to a big extent, but many countries have rebounded and many countries haven't rebounded. So there aren't many countries, but I just showed you, for example, only for Greece. Cyprus is the same as Greece. Other countries are different. For example, Poland is a clear example of negative spillover where there are low trust across all levels of government. Germany is an example of negative compensation where they trust the national government but not the European government a lot. So, I think that when we're discussing policy implications, we need to find citizens where they are. And that means that, that means different things. And I just tried to illustrate a little bit how this varies across countries, but also by level of governance and how these two intersect. And then finally, I think in terms of thinking of, okay, so what? Okay. The more important aspect is perhaps the idea of political trust as something reactive. So there's like a dispositional element of political trust, like your general orientation, but it's also evaluative. And trust is not lost. It can come back, and it can and does so in meaningful ways. So I think that's maybe perhaps a good point to end this discussion. I'm just gonna say real quick that if you're interested in more concrete policy proposals, we have a report on that you can find on the website. And if this sort of research has piqued your interest, I hope I've succeeded in that, then you might want to consider our upcoming book, which is coming out in early 2026. So this is why my mandatory plug. And I'm looking forward to your questions, and maybe we can discuss the concrete examples a bit more in depth. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I have questions for each one of our panelists individually. If I could get your answers briefly, beginning with Ms. Andrea Kosta. Your presentation shows how far-right movements are reshaping who is seen as deserving of rights within European democracies. Given this climate, what practical steps can institutions and citizens take to reaffirm that human rights are universal?
Thank you very much for your question. I would say that first of all, we need to agree that human rights are not only a legal matter. Far-right narratives gain spaces where human rights are being portrayed as something that it's negotiable and something that it's being deserved only by specific groups of people with specific characteristics, the so-called in-groups citizens. Therefore, I would say that institutions could act in two fronts. Firstly, by portraying human rights with concrete and everyday terms so that it will be easier for citizens to understand that human rights are not something that is negotiable, and human rights are under the umbrella of democratic values. And secondly, I would say also that institutions could and should safeguard these democratic values and norms. There are several examples of countries that have raised their electoral thresholds in order to limit the access of extremist voices in entering the parliaments. And this wasn't an act of silencing voices, rather an act of protecting the pluralist characteristics of democracy and protecting, of course, democratic values. And yes, of course, citizens have also an active role in this discussion. I would say that citizens should and could challenge exclusionary narratives, extremist discourses and discriminatory discourses, promote, of course, civic education, and promote inclusion in everyday spaces. In short, I would say that reaffirming that human rights are still perceived as something that is universal, it could be done through a combination of institutional responsibility and civic engagement and, of course, political participation. Thank you.
Thank you. And my next question is to Yiannos Katsourides. Your research and expertise maps out how parties, both the radical left and far right, are reshaping political participation and institutional trust in especially Southern Europe. In that light, could you speak about how institutions should adapt mechanisms of citizen engagement and accountability before visible backsliding sets in?
$1 million question. Okay. Okay. Methodologically, I have to say that I do not treat the radical left and the far right in equal terms. I do not consider, for example, the radical left as a threat to democracy. It can be responsible sometimes, but they are inclusive. The far right is not. The far right is definitely a sign that whatever social contract we had is eroding. And therefore, just as a methodological comment, however, I feel that both the inefficiencies that run through the liberal democratic system and also the deep inequalities, this is the huge problem that provides this fertile ground for the drop in institutional trust. I stopped short of suggestions because I thought that would be part of the question. So I don't have this magic stick so I can find solutions, but I think that the most important thing is to treat the issue of institutional trust, of trust in general, this social and political trust that has been built throughout decades and it's eroding fast. As an asset, as a crucial asset that we need to maintain and preserve, rather than as an afterthought, which is usually sliding our attention. So I would think in three directions: open up authentic channels for citizens' participation, institutionalize them, make them matter, maybe at the local level, maybe at other levels. Do not be afraid of that. Secondly, I would say have checks and balances at the same time, which we introduce constantly checks and balances, but sometimes we introduce too many checks and balances and we create a lot of inefficiencies. So we need to find this balance between having the checks and balances, which are deeply required, and at the same time deliver efficient governance, because this is where on these inefficiencies are the serious problem, part of the serious problem that break this social contract and reduce the trust. And finally, something that I truly believe is, I think we should increase social welfare. We have seen throughout Europe that social welfare is decreasing. We have seen, for example, now after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, that even the monetary rules are changing, but only for defense expenses. I can understand that to some extent, but how about social welfare? Social welfare exposes the state to the citizens. It makes the citizens feel that the institutions do not care about them. And who comes in to fill this void? I think Andrea presented it very well. It will come and it will be exclusive. So I think it's not only procedural, but it's substantive. And I could think of many more, but I will stop here.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Alexandros, Christos, Gkotinakos, your work highlights shifts in how citizens participate outside formal elections and evolving dynamics of political trust. Based on your findings with ActEU, what combinations appear most effective in reversing the trust decline?
Well, that's a very tough question to answer, and if I, had a very good answer, I think that would be great, but I don't. But I think there are a couple of points that we can consider based on what I showed you. And the most important thing is that we have to find citizens where they are, and that's true in many respects. So if you keep thinking about the example I told you about the patterns of trust in Greece, on the one hand, you can say, oh, wow, good, the European Union sort of serves a compensatory function, so the entire political system remains legitimate. But on the other hand, you can see that and say, but it also adds an added pressure to the domestic level, because it's a yardstick by which they can judge their politicians. So I think, first of all, we have to be mindful of this, and we have to keep thinking that political trust is reactive. It's not built in one day, it's not destroyed in one day, but it's a continual process of updating based on information and experiences you have. And I would say that experiences are important, especially where you have them, so at the local level. So it's policy comes from the top, but it needs to trickle down a little bit. There's also we also need to be inclusive, and I think this sort of mirrors what we have already discussed, and it can be true in many respects. So, for example, elections are important. They set the tone of the administration, but they don't have to be the end of be all of political expression. And governments can be mindful. We had some protests in Greece very recently in various issues of the inputs that citizens give through different channels and react to them, because I have to agree with Yiannos. It's sort of both in political systems, the sort of input-output thing. It is about procedure, but maybe as sort of academics or policymakers, we tend to prioritize procedure because that's what we work on. But I don't think we want to put citizens in a dilemma where they have to choose performance and policy outcomes that they like versus procedure. So that's something else I think that we have to keep in mind. And that's all I can think of. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, today we heard democracy in Europe is being contested, redefined, and in many ways tested. Democratic erosion often begins quietly, as Mr. Katsourides mentioned, and trust must be earned through genuine participation, and rights can never be conditional. I'd like to ask our audience whether they have any questions to raise to our panelists briefly for 5 minutes. Yes.
I have a question for Alexandros.
Yes.
I recall myself many times before elections, I would go to this video at an atmosphere, and there was a festive atmosphere before accession to the Eurozone. I recall that. And subsequently, we saw what happened with Greece's economic crisis and the response of the European Union. And what happened in Greece, it was the depression of the century. Greece lost 25% of GDP, lost many people who went abroad, and yet I'm surprised by the trust level that you find in the union to be much higher than the domestic. To me, is the Greek political system that bad, or the Greek public naive and still, wishful thinking about the union? Yes.
Do you have any other questions? Yes, please. But could you speak up a bit?
Yeah, no worries. My name is Eric Jones. Look, this is a great panel and a perfect complement to the panel that came before it. So I guess my question is, to what extent is trust in democratic institutions a function of the narrative that we wrap around democracy, a function of the process through which we engage with citizens through democratic institutions, or a function of the performance of those institutions in terms of economic and political outcomes? Because it seems like if you could answer that question, we could resolve a lot of tension in the panel that came before you.
I can answer it immediately. It's all. But how can we achieve that?
Yes.
So thank you for the great question, and I think it sort of gets to the heart of how we conceptualize and what we expect of political trust. Yes. So I was planning to show this, but I was out of time. So if you were to plot the trend in Greek citizens' trust towards the EU across time, you will see that it was at one point around 2015, trust completely evaporated. Like it was like 12% or something from somewhere in the near 60s. So, obviously it was a very deleterious effect of the political environment. But time has moved on, and politics move on, and domestic, agenda has moved on, and now it seems to be seen as more trustworthy. That the European institutions are more trustworthy. And I have to say that if you break this with by subgroup, you can also find that people who may not be particularly fond of the union may trust it more than domestic institutions. So there are paradoxes in citizens' opinions that we have to accept. So that's that. I don't know if that's a good answer to the question. And then there's a question of what trust, what does it come from, right? Is it, and I have to agree, it's everything, and it's, you know, different constellations of politics, of processes, of the economy. I have to say perhaps the economy is the most important based on current research, but it's not the only thing. And, you know, identity plays a big role. So whether you identify with the ruling party in case of the domestic level, where you identify with Europe, or you feel European, so you tend to trust it more. So there are all kinds of, you know, antecedents of political trust. But I have a caveat that I think that even if we manage to build a lot of trust, it won't be a silver bullet to fix everything, because even in the cases where political trust is important and is related in meaningful ways with the outcomes we care about, the correlation is not that big. I mean, you know, when we're discussing in social science circles, correlations are small and they're elusive and they're context dependent. So I wouldn't suggest, you know, treating trust as the fountain of everything that is good in a society. There are other things that are important as well, but it can serve sort of as a shorthand, as a sort of thing that, an attitude that captures the general legitimacy towards a political system in some cases. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Andrea, do you have anything you'd like to add? Or
I would say that this is the $1 million question for me. So if we take into consideration that trust is the currency of democracy, I would say that it's being spent somehow unevenly, or sometimes without any efficient or impactful outcomes. I would also say that we are living now in, of course, in times of uncertainty. The general disappointment is it's somehow the dominant feeling of citizens, and there is a general mistrust in political systems and in mainstream political actors. A lot of the citizens, they come to reallocate sometimes their trust to different personalities, or sometimes in movements. And from my field of research in far-right politics, I would also add in this that this is also another aspect between others, where far-right actors find fertile grounds, because in these times of uncertainty and of political debates, highly polarized and emotional, they found this fertile ground to provide simple answers to difficult and challenging political issues. And they seem, and they are being perceived from the citizens as the actors who can provide certainty in times of social and political fatigue. And I believe that this is one of the major challenges in Europe, to manage and regain the trust of the citizens, at the same time that we manage to promote active citizenship.
thank you. And I'd like to thank all our panelists, University of Nicosia, ActEU, and all of you for getting involved with this conversation today.